Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wild's the Dome TV. Today, I have a very, very special guest and a fascinating topic at hand. We have today author, scholar, associate professor, Dr. Matthew Pettway, the author of the book Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Placido, and Afro-Latino Religion. Make sure y'all go get that. It's definitely I read this book in 3 days.
Wow.
It's definitely some amazing work with about some African people that you may have never heard of who are um play who are can give I guess when it comes to the African liberation struggle and the things that we went through the past are important figures in what we would call the Caribbean or Latin America. And so
Mhm.
I hope this episode shines some light. Y'all make sure y'all go get the book. But Dr. Petway, thank you for coming through.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
No problem, no problem. I'm excited to have you on. So I kind of want to get started just getting into some of this story. And so could you start by explaining the socio-political landscape of 19th century Cuba, particularly during the Year of the Lash, and how it influenced the works of Placido and Juan Francisco Manzano?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Cuba in the 19th century is a very important place in the Western Hemisphere, despite its relative size, it's small as compared to other countries. And it's important because it's one of the last colonies, European colonies. Doesn't become independent until 1898.
Mhm.
And even that independence is in this U.S. interference in that independence. So Cuba is also important because Cuba replaces the French colony of Saint Domingue, which later became Haiti, as the leading sugar producer in the world.
Mm,
In order to produce that sugar, being that Europeans didn't want to do the work for themselves, they brought in Africans against their will. And so uh, when Cuba replaces Saint Domingue as the largest sugar producing colony in the world, it also brings in a much larger number of African captives than it had previously.
mm,
It's the 1760s that the population increases exponentially.
mhm,
And so Cuba becomes a very different type of landscape. Uh, the anti-Black measures become more intense. The work regime becomes harder. The other thing about Cuba and the population of African descent, both people of African descent born in Cuba as well as Africans themselves, become the numeric minority by the 1820s.
mm, mm.
And so you have a large free Black population, but you also have a Black population born in Africa. And so
Right.
you have some
Mhm,
contact between them, you have some dialogue between them, you have some conflict between them as well. But also the other thing interesting or important about Cuba is that unlike the United States, there's no freedom of the press.
mm,
Unlike the 13 colonies that
mhm,
became the United States,
mhm.
there's no freedom of the press. And so what you have is a strict censorship regime.
Right.
And there are three things the Spanish crown is really concerned about. It's concerned about um, any attack on the monarchy, slander, particularly of influential persons. And also, the Spanish monarchy was concerned about protecting the holy faith.
Mm,
And that's the language, word for word,
mhm,
la Santa Fe,
mm,
the holy faith. And so that put Manzano and Placido in a situation where society was becoming more African in many ways.
mhm.
Um, but they, as the society transformed, anti-Black measures increased. Censorship was very strong. And then the other thing really taking place is that there was fear that Cuba might follow in the
Mhm,
footsteps of Haiti
mhm.
and have a Black revolution of its own.
Absolutely. That last part is one of the things that I found really fascinating because um, Haiti in the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 inspired the entire Black diaspora, right? And we
Mhm,
see
mhm,
a lot of these online arguments about it now, but as we can see, even and then in Cuba, they're like, hey, these brothers and sisters are might be inspired by what's going on over there, and you know, begin to do the same thing here in Cuba,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I
Mm-hmm.
just thought that was a powerful insight because it's a symbol of Pan-Africanism, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so both Placido and Manzano faced immense, you know, personal and political challenges.
Mm-hmm.
How did their life experiences shape their literary works and revolutionary ideas?
Okay. Well, I'll say this: Manzano and Placido's lives were different in some fundamental ways, and then their paths cross at
Yeah.
a pivotal moment. We think the year was 1839. So I'll start with Juan Francisco Manzano since he lived longer and he was born, we believe it was 1797. Manzano was born to an enslaved family that may have been second generation Cuban. He mentions his grandfather, but he doesn't say his grandfather was African. He certainly doesn't say anything about any specific ethnic origins or languages anyone in his family may have spoken. But Spanish would have been his native tongue. His mother was an enslaved uh, servant, household servant, and a wet nurse. Um, and his father played the harp. And
Mm,
they were enslaved people in the big house
mhm,
on these slave labor camps or plantations in Cuba. And I don't want to use the word privilege, but I want to say that it was a family that was allotted certain benefits
mhm.
as a way, because I think privilege is structural. They
Yeah.
don't think they have structural privilege. They can be bought and sold at any time, but there were a lot of certain benefits to be in the big house. They were supposed to be closer to the family, the Manzano family, these nobles. Um, and so Manzano learns to read and write on his own, very much against the will of his enslavers.
Hmm.
He demonstrates a great deal of stick-to-itiveness. But what's interesting about him is that his intellectual and aesthetic processes begin with oral tradition.
Right. Which is totally African, man.
Very African. So we should know that Africa has these written traditions and these oral traditions that existed at the same time. There's a co-presence of both. Um, but when it came to the Africans brought to Cuba against their will, most of them were coming from traditions or from cultures where the oral tradition was prominent. The oral
Hmm.
tradition makes the written tradition possible. And so Manzano his mother would share proverbs with him, and if he didn't understand a proverb, he'd go and talk to the old blacks on the plantation. And, um, Manzano would he learned the Spanish decima,
Mm.
so that's part of the Spanish oral tradition. That was such a short, really 10 verses. It
Hmm.
was the sort of thing that people use their memory a lot more than we do today.
Right.
So he was able to compose those in his head. He memorized the sermons of Catholic Church.
Hmm.
So his learning process really begins, his autodidacticism, that self-learning process really begins with the oral tradition.
Hmm.
And then he takes that. He said, I had a book of poems in my head. I had a book of poems in my head. He said he had a young woman that he
Yeah.
was, I guess, rapping to basically.
Hmm.
And Serafina, right? And then he begins to learn to read and write. So his process kind of starts like that. Manzano eventually becomes free. We believe the year is 1836. That's when the letter was signed, the Freedom Papers essentially,
Hmm.
and that's when we know for sure that his slave narrative
Yeah.
was handed over to the white patron Domingo del Monte, because he had that quid pro quo situation, right? Where they said, look, if you write the slave narrative, we'll buy your freedom. Manzano writes the narrative in order to free himself, despite the shame such a narrative might bring him.
Hmm.
Uh, but Del Monte and his crew of white reformers were concerned not with the abolition of slavery, but the end of the slave trade, because they
Hmm.
wanted to prevent la africanización de Cuba,
Right. Right.
So,
Well, one thing that you kind of like mentioned about Manzano in the big house is, and you know, the like not using the word privilege is because he faced some horrors being right next to his enslaver in that big
That's
house
right.
that you guys can read about whenever you buy this
Mm-hmm.
book.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, some things happened to him where it kind of felt like, at times he felt like a broken man,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so I just wanted to kind of reiterate that as far as,
Mm-hmm.
his proximity to his enslaver didn't afford him. I
That's
mean, it
it.
may have afforded him, certain things maybe, but,
Mm-hmm.
in the end, it was,
Yeah.
he went through hell.
Yeah. He went through hell.
Hmm.
If going through a French opera and sitting under the homilies of a religious institution that has sanctioned your slavery as divine will
Right.
is a privilege, then you can call that a privilege. But
Right. Right.
I would say that's certainly not a privilege. There were the benefits that were accrued to his family could always be taken away.
Mm.
So Spanish slave law said that the enslaved person was part of the enslaver's family, but in effect, they operated as property,
Right.
despite medieval Spanish slave law. So yeah, definitely the case with Manzano. And then with regard to Placido, Placido, in some ways a very different character because Placido was born free in 1809.
Hmm.
He was born of a father who's said to be one-fourth African, a quadroon, effectively. So today you might say a lighter skinned Black person, maybe his features were a combination of two. We don't really know.
Hmm.
But we know that at the time, this is kind of like New Orleans. I live in Mobile, so it's kind of like
Yeah.
New Orleans. At the time, to say that he was a quadroon was to say that's his race.
Mm.
So
Right.
it's a distinct racial category that could be used,
Hmm.
in an effort to get more social power. But his father probably didn't have much of that. His father was a barber, and he himself was a poor man. His mother was a white woman from Burgos,
Hmm.
northern Spain. I've actually been to that town, and
Mm.
it's one of the towns that didn't have a lot of African and Arab influence.
Okay.
They remained Catholic. So,
Okay.
but we know some of the Africans that were in Spain. Some were lighter skinned, Amazigh or Berber,
Hmm.
but some were Black.
Hmm.
Some were of a mahogany hue,
Hmm.
particularly the 11th century dynasty, the Almoravid dynasty. But I say that just to say that Placido was one of those figures where in Cuba, he was supposed to, uh, someone with a lighter hue was supposed to identify with white power and to idealize, romanticize white aesthetic.
Mm.
And what made Placido so offensive to some elements of Cuban society is he did not romanticize that.
Right.
He made fun of that.
Right.
He mocked that in his poetry. So he starts producing poetry in 1834. It's just, I think it's 4 years later that he finds himself in trouble with the law in
Mm.
1838.
Mm.
And he has a very short, his career is like a lightning bolt.
Right.
10 years where he's producing poetry. Once again, the decima, that Spanish poetry form, he's got fables, but these are fables in verse. So once again, the oral tradition very strong, but this time the Iberian oral tradition.
Hmm.
Sonnets, and he becomes Manzano. I'll say this: Placido becomes the most famous person of African descent on the island and the most controversial.
Mm. Wow.
He becomes the most controversial, and their paths cross in 1839,
Mm.
more or less. They differ on the years when they're
Hmm.
when they're interrogated.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I saw that. I saw
Yeah.
that.
So to me, that was chapter was the most enjoyable to write.
Oh,
Chapter 6.
that was one of the most interesting parts because I mean you could see that happening in today's time,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah, yeah.
um one of the fascinating things that uh you wrote about in your analysis is the idea of transculturation. Um,
Hmm.
and for those who may not understand what that is, can you talk about just transculturation and how Placido and Manzano embodied this process in their poetry, blending Catholicism with African religious elements?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So transculturation is a very important way of thinking about how Latin American culture comes into existence. But the idea was coined by a Cuban actually a Cuban attorney by the
Mm,
name of Don Fernando Ortiz. So he was doing work in the early 20th century, like other white scholars around the world, that had to do with African culture and African-derived or African-inspired cultures. He did his work in Spain, and his early work, before he develops transculturation, his early work was explicitly and offensively racist.
mm,
His first book is called The Black Witch Doctors, or Los Negros Brujos. And um, and so he basically says that Cuba is degenerate because it has maintained its African cultural elements. How will Cuba ever advance? And so he says this in a moment in which Latin American countries are explicitly encouraging European immigration and adapting a series of measures to make it easier for whites to come to Latin America to somehow civilize. This is post-emancipation.
mhm,
And this is happening throughout Latin America. And around 1940, Ortiz develops a different notion. After spending some time, because he's writing his early work, he's in Spain during part of the process. I don't know the exact dates when he comes, but I know he's in Spain. Uh, when he gets back, when he spends more time in Cuba, he becomes more acquainted with the cabildos, or they're no longer cabildos, but with the religious organizations. He becomes to recognize the complexity, particularly of Yoruba thought.
mm,
And he begins to realize that that Catholic images, particularly the images of the Virgin Mary,
mhm.
Catholic saints, had a double meaning.
I love that.
That
I'm sorry. I read that. I loved reading about that. I mean, because it's something obviously that we know whenever we look at religion in Cuba now with Lukumi and
Mhm.
Paulo and things like that. But just to hear you, I mean, to see you write it the way you wrote it in the context of Placido and Manzano's poetry was it was that was something else, man. But if you can't, just I just had to say that, right? Because
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. So he develops this idea of transculturation, where he says that Cuban blacks had not fully acculturated to Spanish Catholic culture,
Mhm,
despite the fact that you had censorship of printed material, that you had a militia to keep people in check, despite the fact that you had a rigorous slave regime, despite, I
mhm,
could go on and on and on, despite the fact that everyone was supposed to be baptized, that they had essentially taken the cultural implements of the oppressing culture, of the dominant culture, and they transformed them,
mm,
infused them with new meaning. And
mhm,
so in Placido Manzano's work, what I argue is that when Ortiz talks about transculturation, he talks about tobacco,
right.
actually.
Okay.
And he talks about the way tobacco went from being a sacred item among indigenous Cubans to becoming a panacea for
Mm,
Europeans, an item of pleasure, a commercial item, how it was commercialized, and
mhm,
it lost its sacrality.
mm,
And so he uses tobacco as an example of transculturation, but he says that transculturation had taken place in every avenue of Cuban life.
right.
Um, and so I use it to understand their representations of religion,
Mhm,
and argue effectively that what looks like a simple Catholic, emblem,
mhm,
in many instances has a double meaning. So Manzano and Placido use Catholic symbolism to achieve this transculturated colonial literature, which is what I call it. They use double entendre. They use a lot of euphemism,
mm, mhm,
willful obfuscation. So they just hide some things entirely, don't let you know entirely. And they use certain elements of what would have been considered popular religiosity, like Placido has that poem called The Little Devil, where he's talking about the African masquerade.
right.
And it would have been really hard for us, I think, in my estimation, it would have been really hard for one of the censors to be offended by that poem, because Africans were allowed to parade
Mhm,
on Epiphany, the
mm,
6th of January, and they were thought to be uncivilized according to the Spanish. So they're kind of doing their thing. This is Cosa
right.
de Negros. That's black stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
That's how that translates. Cosa de Negros.
Mhm,
They're doing their stuff over there. So people will laugh at it, but they didn't really know what it meant. And Placido
mhm,
takes advantage of that,
hmm,
and he turns that into a revolutionary poem. So I argue that the literature maintains a Spanish facade,
Mhm.
Catholic facade, but beneath the surface, more is going on.
There's one poem that you mentioned. I forgot what the name of it was, but I think it was from Placido, and the analysis that you gave was extremely interesting because there was one poem where it's I can't remember if it was multiple or just one, but it's like he was praying to one of the saints to help him, but he did with no mention of the Holy Trinity.
Oh, okay, okay.
And I can't remember which one it was, but I thought that was I thought that was
Is it
powerful because
Placido or Manzano?
it might have been Manzano.
Okay.
I can't. It's towards the end, but it
Hmm.
was that idea of if this was
Oh, yeah.
truly if this was just Catholicism, there would
Hmm.
have been mention of the Holy Trinity whenever I
Hmm.
am calling out to to save me from this condition that I'm in of
Hmm.
slavery, right? And I just thought
Hmm.
I thought that was extremely eye opening because for somebody just reading it, right, they can say, okay, this is just this is deeply rooted in Catholicism and nothing else
Hmm.
because of I guess his devotion to the saints or that saint, but the lack of mentioning of the anything else Catholic or the
Hmm.
main tenets, which would be the Holy
Hmm.
Trinity. Now I have the eyes to be able to see, like whenever you're looking at literature from that time, in a in a place that was colonized by Spain and the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church, all of these things that we see and that we think are Catholicism are there's some underlying
Yeah.
undercurrents
Yeah.
of African traditional religions there.
Yeah. And I'm thinking you might be thinking of Manzano because
Hmm.
he credits the saints
Yeah, yeah,
with
you're right.
having, yeah, with
Yeah.
having
Hmm.
he credits the saints with having secured his escape from Matanzas to Havana.
Now, like in Catholicism, wouldn't that be a little weird to say if it was strictly just a Catholic notion of deliverance? Because like I'm not Catholic, I don't
Hmm.
but you even kind of mentioned that some of the church fathers were like,
Hmm.
yo, you should this
Yeah.
is not what
Yeah.
we're supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah. Cubans did it.
Hmm.
Cubans did it broadly. What's interesting is when Father Felix Varela criticizes Cuban religiosity, which he just calls superstition.
Hmm.
Superstition is the key word.
Hmm.
A lot of people think the word witchcraft would have been the word that was used to refer to um, religious traditions that weren't sanctioned by the Catholic Church or by Protestant churches. But superstition was the word, actually. Witchcraft was used when it was assumed that the powers were being conjured in order
Hmm.
to uh, present a militant threat to white supremacy, to
Hmm.
the system of white supremacy. So yeah, Father Felix Varela is talking about Cubans writ large. He says all of you guys are talking about mystical battles between the saints.
Hmm.
You're arguing which saints are the most miraculous. Um, some of you have set yourselves up as oracles of authority.
Right.
And so he said your theology is completely flawed, deeply flawed. He does not specify racially
Hmm.
what he's talking about. So in Cuba, uh, the the saints are engaged in a way that is was unorthodox, according to Father Faith Varela, who's writing at the same time that Manzano and Placido are publishing their poetry. And one of the things with Manzano, I argue in the book, is that Manzano's relationship to the Catholic saints uh, is more akin to the relationship that an African from what is now Nigeria or Benin would have with the Orishas, the
Absolutely.
African divine spirits.
Hmm.
I won't call them gods, I'll call them African divine spirits, to use the language of Dr. Wallin Dotson. So he's thinking, he says, look, I think I may have angered some of the
Right.
saints.
Right.
And so that's why my situation is so bad. So I got to get this right.
Hmm.
And there's a moment in which he's escaping from the plantation. around 1817. We don't know the exact year. Roberto Friol, the Cuban scholar, tells us around 1817. And he's at a crossroads.
Mm.
And so when he's at a crossroads, he says the saints got him on the other side. And he mentions one saint in particular, San Antonio or Saint Anthony. And in Cuban religious tradition, the more Nigerian or Yoruba-inspired tradition, Saint Anthony is the spirit of the crossroads. He's Legba or Elegua.
Mm. Right.
And so consistently, when he talks about emancipation,
mm-hmm.
more than not, the Christian God is not a redemptive figure.
Right.
He's not crying out to Jesus Christ. He's saying, I've got to do something to get the power necessary to liberate myself. I have to procure the power necessary to liberate myself. And that's what had me just like, whoa.
Same. Me too. When I read it, that was a powerful thing to read, because just trying to, do your best to even see it through their eyes, right? And with all the censorship, with being enslaved or formerly enslaved, or living at least in a in a in a country that has enslavement of your people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to and this African culture that they would like to get rid of and do away with, to be able to use some literary subversion
Mm-hmm.
to get that point across.
Mm-hmm.
Powerful. I
Mm-hmm.
just I think, I mean, just a testament to our ancestors, and the ingenuity that they had, and the will and determination. But just reading that, I told you that like before, like just reading that, like I felt, I got chills, because that's just
Wow.
that's a powerful concept,
Wow.
um, and that's another thing I wanted to kind of ask you, like censorship being rampant, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did they navigate and subvert,
Mm-hmm.
these this censorship, and convey their radical ideas?
I think that one of the ways in which they did it was to say without saying,
Mm.
to imply, to kind of wink and nod. Um, One of the poems, I know you were interested, if you don't mind me kind of
Oh
jumping
yeah.
ahead a
Oh,
little bit,
absolutely, absolutely.
but El Juramento, or
Yes.
the Oath,
Hmm.
is one of those poems. And I think I have the whole poem here. Yeah, I have the whole poem. Is it okay if I read
Yeah,
it?
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm going to read the Oath and talk a little bit about this poem, because I
Hmm.
think that this is Placido's sonnet.
Hmm.
So the sonnet was considered, and still is considered, quite frankly, in English classes, the height of poetry,
Wow.
highbrow poetry.
Hmm.
And so he's writing it. So in one way, he's demonstrating I'm as much a poet as a guy who was educated at the University of Havana.
Mm. Right, right.
uh, but he's doing something very different with the form. So he says, quote, the Oath, quote, in the shadow of a towering tree that stands at the end of an ample valley, there is a fount that bids you drink its pure and silvery water. There I went by my duty called, and making an altar of the hardened earth
Hmm.
before the sacred code of life, my hands extended, I have sworn an oath to be the eternal enemy of the tyrant, if it is possible, to tarnish my vestments with his detestable blood by my hand, shedding it with repeated blows, and dying at the hands of an executioner, if need be, to break the yoke.
Mm.
And that's how the poem ends.
See, if for those that may not have caught that, that is extremely anti-colonial. It is extremely, like, that's a diss record. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah,
how
yeah.
did he? But so did the. So do you think? All right, his own community, would they have seen that and known exactly what he was trying to convey? Like when you mentioned it's kind of like a wink, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
is that something that the Africans on the plantation, or
Mm-hmm.
even free Africans, would they have
Mm-hmm.
kind of understood what he was saying there?
That was something that I really tried to determine as much as I could.
Hmm.
Um, in the process of researching the book. So the book is, cultural studies, literary studies,
Hmm.
but then there's that cultural history element,
Hmm.
that part where I wanted to say, but this is history too.
Yeah,
These guys are
absolutely.
historical figures. But I was able to determine, I'll say this about the poem first, and then I'll kind of try to answer your question. Um, that the first two stanzas of the poem,
Hmm.
in the shadow of a towering tree, and then the other that starts, there I went by my duty called. I think those are far more coded.
Hmm.
He's using indirect language. Um, but the last two stanzas are explicit.
Yeah,
And
the
so he,
tyrant.
yeah,
Yeah, like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And
And
there's a Spanish poet named Jacinto Sáenz de Quiroga who said, I don't know how he got this
right.
published. He said he
Right.
got this published in Matanzas, but there's no way he could have got this published in Capital, in
Mm,
Havana.
right, right.
So
And that would have been something that the crown would have known exactly who he was talking about, right?
yeah, exactly what
Yeah,
he's talking about.
yeah.
And he was in prison at least three times. He was imprisoned at least three times before finally he was arrested in 1844.
Mm,
This was not a person with military experience.
right, right.
Unlike some of the other black men in the era, Manzano also didn't have military experience. So what I think he's doing, I think the notion of the towering tree, it's a metaphor without specificity.
Hmm.
So it could be the palm tree, it could be the ceiba tree, and the ceiba tree, Africans associated with the baobab tree
Mm,
because of its size, and
hmm.
it's not as mighty. I've seen both.
Hmm.
I've seen the baobab in Ghana, thank God, and I've seen the ceiba in Cuba, thank God. But the baobab is so large it could be a
Yeah.
building,
Right, right, right,
but
right.
still they're associated. And what they do with the ceiba is they put around the ceiba uh, spiritual articles, and it's a sacred. It can be made into a sacred space. It's considered a very important tree. So I think he leaves it open by using the language of tower tree. And I call that liturgical ambiguity.
Hmm. Hmm.
Don't tell him everything.
Right, 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 right.
And then he talks about making an altar of the hardened earth.
Hmm.
So that altar has a double meaning because the altar, the Catholic altar, but the Catholic altar is within the sanctuary.
Mm, right.
Catholic altar might have images of the saints or the Virgin Mary or, you know, or the Christ, but it's not going to be outside.
Yeah, and you also even talked about in the book, like there was a spiritual sacredness with the forest and nature
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
related to that poem, correct? As
Mm-hmm.
far
That's
as
right.
the first couple of stanzas,
Mm-hmm. As far
which
as the
was
first couple stanzas, yeah.
rooted in, again, as you say, a possible Bakongo or Yoruba uh, traditions.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So that poem, you could either look at the Bakongo,
Hmm.
or I think you could even look at Abakwa, that
Hmm.
Male Initiation Society, which
Hmm.
is from Nigeria as well, Cross Rivers region, eastern Nigeria, to
Hmm.
understand what might be going on there because the silhouette or the shadow of the tree is sacred.
Wow.
Yeah. So um, what I really fought to understand with this poem, Rakim, that was so hard for me was what does he mean by a sacred code of life?
Mm,
And I could not believe I read the work of several scholars, people's work who I respect,
hmm.
historians, and some Cuban, some North American, and nobody had really explored the meaning of the oath
Hmm.
from a theoretical standpoint, what he might have meant. One historian points to the fact that he issued oaths, Aisha Finch, and she did a very good job. We actually exchanged some materials back and forth. We helped each other out, but no one had really explored what that oath was.
Hmm.
And it seems like he issued different oaths to different Black men,
Wow.
depending upon whether or not he considered them men of strength, hombre de
Mm,
pecho.
mm,
They had the difference that they were hombre de pecho and
hmm.
reliable
Right.
in order to get the oath. So with the sacred code of life, uh, I would like to see further research done on it, to be honest, because as a scholar, you have to acknowledge what you know and
Hmm.
what you weren't fully able to ascertain. But I believe that it's tied to those initiation societies in some type of way. One of the
So,
most powerful things that African people had is that they would initiate boys into manhood
hmm,
and they would initiate girls into womanhood.
so the Abuqua societies, the leopard societies, they were already existing in Cuba at that time.
The Yes,
Wow.
yes, yeah, yes is the answer. The poem is published in 1840.
Hmm.
The first lodge, the Abacoa Lodge, is 1836 outside of Havana in a little
Hmm.
town called Regla,
Hmm.
right there on the port
Hmm.
and on the water. And prior to that, you had the folks or the people from that region. They were called people from Calabar. Calabar is the name of the town. Calabar. They were called Calabar. Si no eres de Congo, si no eres de Congo, eres Carabalí. They were called Carabalí.
Mm.
Carabalí. Carabali in Spanish, Carabalí. But it didn't mean they were necessarily from Calabar, but that they had been shipped out of that port. So
Ah.
they,
Hmm.
yes, they may
Hmm.
have been from, you know,
Hmm.
it's like if someone ships me out of New Orleans and I never return home, people don't know I'm from Detroit. They're like,
Yeah.
them old
Hmm.
NOLA boys,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah.
like that. So,
Hmm.
so where are we going?
Oh, no, 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 no. Like, just I was wondering about the Abuqua Society
Oh,
because
yes, yes.
it's obviously, for people that don't know, it still exists here. I mean, it still exists to this day,
Hmm.
and it exists outside of Cuba. As
Hmm.
you know, there's some here. You might not never know it. They'll probably never tell you, but
Hmm.
whenever we research and study, African fraternal groups and secret societies, that was always the first one that would come up whenever I would do that research,
Oh,
right? And
wow.
so when I read that there was a possible connection, that was another thing that was fascinating. So I definitely wanted to ask you about that. You also in your book give great analysis on Cuba at this time, as far as race identity and what you call a pigmentocracy. And
Hmm. Hmm.
if you can, like, discuss that concept of a pigmentocracy and
Hmm.
how these two poets kind of challenge racial hierarchies of their time through their literary works. Because from what it seems like, especially Placido, like he was the people's champ when it comes to Black people,
Hmm. Yeah,
right?
yeah, he was the people's champ.
Mhm.
Yeah. Placido was the people's, he was the poet of the people.
Right.
And he was the most prolific Cuban poet in the 19th century. And
Mm.
he only had 10 years.
Wow.
You
Wow.
know, he's dropping an album basically
Yeah,
every year,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
He published all these, poetic collections, and he published throughout different parts of Western Cuba.
Hmm.
And his work spread. A word about him, we were talking a little bit earlier about trying to understand the extent to which his work would have been legible to Black people and to African people. We do we know that his name was known on the plantations.
Mm.
We know that.
Mm.
We know that he visited plantations. That
Hmm.
was one of the things that colonial state, was upset about. And we also know um, that when he mentioned something like the carnival masquerade, Ireme, also known as Diablito, or the little devil, that would have resonated with Africans.
Mm. Right.
That specifically would have resonated with Africans because he describes it. He describes how it looks. Um, with regard to, we're talking about
The
pigmentocracy.
pigmentocracy,
Yeah.
and just where
Hmm.
they fit in, with that.
Yeah. With regard to the pigmentocracy, that's a term Latin American scholars use to describe this hierarchy based on skin color.
Hmm.
And with skin color, it's presumed that, also it's talking about hair texture, the shape and the slope of the nose, the size of the lips, all that stuff. Um, and so one thing I think I should say that might be helpful for listeners is that Latin American and Caribbean racial universe is different than the North American racial
Hmm.
universe. So the North American racial universe, I would say maybe at the beginning of the 19th century, maybe a little bit prior, really becomes a black-white dichotomy.
Hmm.
It's no longer Christian Indian.
Hmm.
It's black-white.
Hmm.
And that black-white dichotomy is something that the United States doesn't really lose, even though statistics say that there are more Latino people in the United States than there are Black people, African American and Black people in the United States. But Latin America wasn't like that. It was a racial pyramid.
Hmm.
So in both systems, you have the perversion in that whiteness is thought to be superior. So you have that myth
Hmm.
functioning, and you have laws being implemented in order to ensure that become so, right?
Right.
In both cases. But there, but instead of one drop of black blood making someone black, one drop of white blood was thought to make someone other than black, something other than black.
Right.
That's what the term quadroon used to refer to, the cuarteron that was used for the Placido's father comes in. And so it was a means of divide and conquer. So
Hmm.
even though race is not biological fact, it was asserted to be biological fact. And it goes really deep when it comes to Spanish America because those ideas go back to the 1400s,
Right. I
you
think
know.
uh, that's why I brought up Placido and his relationship, with the brothers and sisters on the plantation and how they viewed him because even though this pigmentocracy was a tool used to divide black people, right?
Mm-hmm,
And maybe
mm-hmm,
not just black people, like all people, like which quote unquote people of color. Um,
mm-hmm.
but that didn't seem to work when it came to Placido, right? Because the people loved him, and I thought that was, how like sometimes whenever you're reading something, it may not be one of the main points of the book, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there's always something that kind of catches you, and that was one of the things because I just thought that was maybe a symbol of how we need to be in
Mm-hmm,
2024, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And but just that, what do you think it was about Placido though
mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
made the people just like, yeah, this is our guy?
It's a guy. I think probably a number of things. I think one of the things that would probably at play was that Placido was a poor man.
Mm. Hmm.
So Placido was a person of a lighter skin, and perhaps he had wavy hair or something like that. But economically, he was disenfranchised, like the
Mm.
vast majority of people, black or white, in a
Hmm.
slave society. Only very few benefit, you know. And I think that was a factor. I think the other thing is that he was a poetic genius,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so he was improvising all the time,
Right.
And one of the Spanish forms, I think it's I think it's the decima.
Hmm.
They give you the last verse,
Hmm.
and they say you've got to compose a poem, and you got to use that last verse. I mean, it's
Wow.
like, whoa! You imagine
Wow.
somebody doing that in a rap battle?
Right. That's
You
crazy.
got it, yeah. But you have to do it with rhyme and meter.
Wow.
So you
Wow.
got to have only 10 verses. You can't just improvise and just go on. All the stuff is coming to your mind, and you're brilliant. That's great, but you got to form.
Wow.
And so that he was able to do that
Mm.
on the spot. So if someone
Mm.
said something to him, a little sly joke, he would like respond with a poem,
Wow.
So he evoked a lot of laughter in people.
Hmm.
He made fun of alcoholism, made fun of hypocrisy. He made fun of the African descended men that didn't want to be,
Mm.
well, didn't want to acknowledge the African
Yeah.
ancestry. I think that played a big role. And I think that, but Plasto has been thought of by critics, both Cuban and North American, as someone who uh, was accused of being part of a
Hmm.
anti-slavery movement, but wasn't part of it.
Right.
Someone who was falsely accused. And so some didn't take him as seriously as more recent scholars have taken him, like Daisy Quay, who said, wait a minute, he was involved. Very important Cuban scholar. And she said, wait a minute, he was involved. And we can demonstrate that he was.
Hmm.
Um, and so I try to take that to the next level of exploring
Hmm.
the theory behind his
Yeah.
revolutionary thought.
Oh, you did. You took that. I don't think we can. I don't think we can debate that. Like whether he was involved. That man was involved.
It was involved.
But um, you and so, do you think that as far as scholars before that didn't acknowledge Placido's involvement, who kind of made him and Manzano like um I would say, just gave him this they kind of pictured them as, they don't know what's going on,
Oh
or
yeah,
yeah, like, so was this
yeah,
a politically motivated type of thing? Um, to kind of, uh, I guess, downplay the fact that a lot of their poetry was revolutionary, and they were
yeah,
actually involved in a plot to overthrow their enslaver.
yeah. I think that it was. I think a lot of it
Hmm.
was because the academy, you know, the academy in Cuba
Hmm.
uh, has been very conservative,
Hmm.
and I think that the people that were writing the history, who had
Hmm.
the largest voice in writing the history of Cuban literature before there really was such a thing as Cuban literature, kind of
Hmm.
gathering all the authors, evaluating them, they were largely white men.
Hmm.
But Cuba was not a society where only white men were writing.
Right.
You had all types of black men and formerly, yeah, other enslaved poets,
Hmm.
who were producing literature like Ambrosio Chemendia, Jose de Carmen Diaz, Juan Antonio Frias. All these people are publishing after, Manzano, not just writing, but publishing. You had a black press born in 1842. I don't
Hmm.
know if any black newspapers existed before that. So really, there's a dialogue going back and forth,
Hmm.
but the people with the institutional power are
Hmm.
the white men. And so when it comes to Placido, because he was of lighter skin, I
Hmm.
think they thought they could sell Placido more
Yeah.
easily
Yeah. Yeah.
because he was of lighter skin. So he was supposed to be, once again, being of lighter skin, supposed to mean that his political interests were white.
Right. But they clearly they clearly weren't.
They clearly were not.
One thing again, we kind of touched on it earlier, but I just wanted to, if you can, just kind of elaborate a little bit on the Haitian Revolution,
Oh yeah.
and the profound impact on enslaved people that it had in Cuba,
Hmm.
and the fear that it also um, evoked in the the Spanish authorities, as
Hmm.
far as the
Hmm.
crown and the slave society itself.
Yeah, the Haitian Revolution is the most significant event in the first 25 years in Latin America for a number of reasons. One, it's an example, historical example, where enslaved people overthrew their enslavers and established a state of their own.
Hmm.
It's the first Black republic to exist in the world. Black was not an identifier used in Africa prior to the
Right.
Atlantic slave trade. Um, it's significant because the Haitian Constitution, the Haitian Declaration of Independence by Dessalines identifies the French as an enemy, specifically the French. Some Polish ended up fighting with the Haitians, so the Haitians allowed them to assimilate into the nation. But that Constitution says that there can be no white property ownership.
Mm.
It says that all Haitians are declared Black, and that a good Haitian man is a good father, and a good Haitian woman is a good mother.
Wow.
It's a very powerful document. That Haiti had many constitutions,
Hmm.
so this constitution unfortunately did not stand. Um, but Haiti becomes an example of what Black agency would look like. Haiti is par excellence example of the Black radical tradition, as
Mm.
Cedric Robinson says.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so it was very frightening because the French had assumed that Africans weren't capable of this.
Right.
I think it was more than arrogance. It was arrogance, but I think it was the result of being involved in that slave trade for so long, the buying and selling of human beings. So early European reports on the west coast of Africa described thriving cities, flourishing towns. Europe was in search of the gold trade. That's why they went there in the first place. Um, but I think the centuries of buying and selling people and having them at your disposal, at your every erotic whim,
Hmm.
having them build your empire, fight your wars, all of that really, uh, I think it shifted fundamentally the way that Europeans saw Africans. Um, and it affected the, the representation. So the Haitian Revolution was considered an impossibility when
Right.
it happened. It was considered an impossibility. And the fear was that Haiti would be repeated in Cuba. And this is something that Domingo del Monte, the white reformer that organizes the collection for Manzano's emancipation for his manumission, is something that he writes. He says, I'm afraid there may be an Ethiopic republic,
Mm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
or Ethiopian republic, Ethiopic or Ethiopian. Ethiopian might be a little better way of putting it, but that's what he feared.
Right.
And effectively, it was a fear uh, not only that the stereotypes might not be true,
Hmm.
but that Africans might be capable of sovereignty.
Right. Which would kill all of the justifications that they
Mm-hmm.
used to
Mm-hmm.
enslave African people in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing also when it comes to, you know, great black writers and thinkers, two people that came up in the book as well that you just wrote about briefly as far as them writing about Placido or Manzano, but I think it's important to highlight that fact because it just shows you how uh, powerful and inspirational our stories can be,
Mm-hmm.
and transcend time and space. And so Schomburg and Martin Delany
Mm-hmm.
both
Mm-hmm.
wrote about Placido, and uh, Delaney and Blake, and Schomburg. Did you say it was in his essay, "The Negro Digs Up His Past"?
He writes the Negro digs up his past, and
Because that essay is actually in uh, the Elaine Locke's "The Negro," written by several authors.
yeah,
So,
it's in there. I'm trying to
mhm,
remember where he writes about Placido. Actually, I'm looking at the book here
mhm.
because he has a piece called Placido, a Cuban Martyr.
Okay. Okay. All right. So yeah, that's it. Right. Okay. So I'm
Yeah.
I still need to read that. I did read obviously the Negro Digs Up His Past, and I've
Mm-hmm.
read Blake from Delaney, but um just the fact that they wrote about them then, right? Um was Placido and Manzano, would that have taken like some real research for those brothers to have
Mm-hmm.
even known about
Mm-hmm.
them in the first place? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's 2024 and I still don't see a lot of people still knowledgeable about this story. So the fact that
No, not at
Schomburg and
all.
Delaney wrote about them,
Mm-hmm.
um, what does that say to you?
I think it says that both Schomburg and Delaney were thinking in what you might call Pan-Africanist way
Hmm.
or Proto-Pan-Africanist way. Delaney, in particular, uh, was really a polymath.
Yeah.
You know, Delaney had knowledge of Delaney traveled, more specifically, Delaney traveled to Nigeria, to Abeokuta, to where Wole Soyinka's from. Wole Soyinka wasn't alive at the time, but he traveled there to negotiate because he wanted to establish trade between African Americans and Nigerians, a type of trade that would not have anything to do with the Atlantic
Hmm.
slave trade. It's after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. He fought in the Civil War. He published this novel. He's thinking in a hemispheric way. I think the question was for Delaney, what does Black liberation look like?
Right.
He
Right.
believed in Black self-defense.
Hmm.
He owned firearms. Uh, so he's asking that question. When he becomes involved in the Civil War, it's okay, we're gonna emancipate enslaved people here.
Right.
But he's still thinking hemispherically, and the novel demonstrates that because the novel imagines a hemispheric anti-slavery revolution. And he put Placido at the center of that in the novel, though he makes Placido explicitly Christian.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the other thing um, with regard to Schomburg is Schomburg, of course, coming after Delaney. It's really interesting to compare them. I wonder if anyone has written about them, comparing them.
Hmm.
But Schomburg is that Black Puerto Rican bibliophile. He's the
Yeah.
person responsible for founding the Schomburg Center.
Hmm.
It's this Center of African American Studies that we don't associate with anybody Latino. Now,
Right.
Schomburg is significant because Schomburg said, yeah, soy puertorriqueño, I'm Puerto Rican, but I'm Black as well.
Hmm.
So he did not see a conflict between the two.
Right.
The two were intricately, woven together for him.
Hmm.
And so he would spend time with the Latinos, or he would spend time with African Americans, and he cultivated relationships with African Americans. And as a bibliophile, he collected, he started the collection
Yeah,
that became the Schomburg Center, part of the
absolutely.
New York Public Library. So he's thinking hemispherically. I think the thing that can be taken from both of them is that, yes, like I'm African American, right? So yes, I can say the country that enslaved my ancestors has a debt to me and has a debt to other African Americans. But I'm also, if I'm going to be radical, I'm going to get to the root of the problem, I'm also responsible for asking myself, what's my relationship to the struggle of African people around the world?
Mm.
And that's a difficult question,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
it means you got to read some stuff you may not feel like reading. You got to talk to some folks.
Hmm.
You might need to study some languages. You got to get on the plane,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And you got to
right,
go beyond the beaches,
right.
right?
Don't go as
So
a tourist all the time, right?
yeah,
Hmm.
so you can you can enjoy the beaches, that's fine, but is there anything beyond that? Because then it means you got to have political consciousness beyond that,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that's hard because your life is difficult, got a lot going on. You want to go abroad and just kind of relax and chill, and it's like, but do I have consciousness of the political struggle there?
Yeah.
So that's that's really, I think, part of the challenge.
Hmm.
African American activists have the right to say that uh, the descendants of the enslaved should be, the damage done to them should be repaired at every level.
Absolutely.
And there is a distinction to be made, a real distinction, but that shouldn't preclude my interest in the struggle of other Black people and my involvement, if
Right.
possible, in the
Absolutely.
struggle of other Black people.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And uh one thing that kind of going back just a little bit, but I think I wanted, to kind of elaborate on the concept and this idea that in Cuba at the time, that Catholicism was this universal truth, right?
Mm,
And
mhm,
pluriversality, where
mm, mhm,
where African and indigenous ideas are not necessarily conflicting, right? There can be
mhm,
more
mhm,
than one truth, which we can see with a lot of people who practice African traditional religions to this day, because there's
mhm,
somebody that might practice Isheshe and Voodoo, or
mhm,
and they don't
mhm. That's
conflict,
right.
but they don't
That's right.
necessarily mix them. It's just
That's right.
it's two worldviews that they participate in. And so if you can just kind of elaborate on that idea, because I think just as an African, I think that is extremely important, because
Mhm, mhm,
a lot of the idea of
mhm.
a one universal truth can also lead to others being oppressed.
Yeah, it can. It can.
And so yeah, if you can just elaborate on this idea.
Yeah.
Mm.
The idea of a universal truth is cousin, is a very much connected to, very similar to the notion of a chosen people.
Mm.
And it's a
Mm.
very attractive idea. It's an alluring idea, the
Hmm.
notion that God has chosen us for this time.
Absolutely.
Because if the word of God is inerrant, and he's chosen my people, and that means your people are outside of the favor of God,
Hmm.
and therefore can be subjected to all
Mm.
sorts of, punishments and hostilities. It's just not true. It's
Right,
just not true. I'll say that.
right, right,
I'll say
right,
that, and I'll
right.
say it like that. Pluriversality was an idea that really caught my attention, in part because I'm a Black man from Detroit whose father was a convert to Islam.
Hmm.
My mother left my father. She took us back to her Black church,
Mm. Hmm.
it was kind of a non-denominational, kind of a middle-class church. We weren't middle class, but that was the aspiration,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and but but it's really interesting because I grew up with those different traditions, and then I began to study African-inspired religion, and uh, I think the concept, Nolo, in his work, puts the concept forward, and he takes it from the Zapatista movement in Mexico. And what it says essentially is that instead of there being a universal truth, there is a domain, there's a space in which many worlds can coexist
Right.
and they interact. And so what you have is dialogue between them.
Mm.
So someone might say, oh my goodness, I just did something I shouldn't have done. I need the Lord to forgive me. And by saying that, they may be channeling the Christian redemptive narrative. And at the same time, they may say, okay, tonight I got to talk to my dad because I think I offended my ancestors.
Mm. Right.
That's an example of pluriversality.
Right.
And I feel I don't condemn religion,
Mm-hmm.
by any means. Recently in Morocco, and my father was a convert to Islam, like I said before, from Mobile, Alabama.
Indeed.
And
Indeed. Indeed.
I called his name, and in a couple of words of Arabic I could manage.
Mm-hmm.
Thankful to the Moroccan professors that helped me with that. So I honor him as a Muslim. But I take the pluriversal approach,
Mm-hmm.
um, because it prevents the creation of unnecessary and dangerous dogma.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. I 100% agree. And um yeah, I definitely I think it's dangerous to be, you know, dogmatic in that manner. And I'm not knocking anybody's personal beliefs. I would never do that, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
um dogmatism is not just only for the individual at times.
Mm-hmm.
It can be institutional, and that's when, we can run
Yeah,
into problems, right?
yeah.
Um, um, so the last thing I want to ask you, the conspiracy of 1844.
Oh.
Uh, and for anybody that, was, when you're watching this, and you'll learn more about this whenever you read the book. But if you thought that Manzano and Placido were just poets, oh, they were implicated in 1844 in a conspiracy to, it was, I forgot the exact word, but it was a
Oh,
conspiracy
yeah.
to
It was a conspiracy to exterminate the white
yes, yeah,
population of the
that's what
island.
Cuba
Yeah.
said, right? So
Hmm.
if you can elaborate a little bit on the conspiracy itself, and I guess how these events influence their legacy today.
Okay.
You
I'll
don't have to give them
use,
everything
yeah,
because
yeah,
I want, I
yeah.
want, I want, I want people to go buy the book. So
I appreciate
yeah,
that,
yeah. We don't have to give
Rakim.
them
I
everything.
appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And if you want,
Well,
actually, just kind of give a brief summary of the conspiracy of 1844, and I
okay,
guess maybe you can concentrate on how this event did influence their legacy that we know
okay,
now. And
okay.
if everybody wants to know, like, the inner workings of what happened in 1844, you got about a book. But I definitely, it's worth it. It's a great book. But go ahead.
No, I appreciate that, man. So the 1844 movement was typically called the ladder conspiracy or la escalera in Spanish. And the reason why it's called the ladder conspiracy is because African people and people of African descent were tied to ladders and tortured.
Mm,
So, of course, the ladder is vertical, implement, vertical tool. And so if you tie someone to a ladder, their entire body is exposed, and they're defenseless. But
mm,
that was the word that was used to describe it. Historian Aisha Finch, African American historian Aisha Finch, began using the language of the 1844 movement.
mm,
And we were very much in dialogue when we were writing our books.
mm,
And I like that language. And I
mm,
say, it's a better way of thinking about this. Because if you use the language of the ladder conspiracy, then you're taking the most horrific things, some of the most horrific things that happened, and you're using them to name a process, a historical process where really Africans and their descendants were seeking to free themselves. So why don't we call it, what Finch calls it? And I'll sometimes call it the 1844 anti-slavery movement,
mm, mm,
because anti-slavery philosophy essentially says not only that slavery is unnatural, it should never exist,
mm,
that to submit yourself willingly to the will of another is unethical, but also it calls for radical racial equality as well at the same
mm,
time. And I really believe that the Haitian Revolution in its earliest iteration sought that under the leadership of Dessalines. With regard to the 1844 movement, really you're talking about a series of uprisings over a period of time, I want to say 4 to 5 years. And they were separate centers of activity that had a relationship to one another. The relationship did exist. Finch gets into this in her book more than Robert Paquette before her. That the relationship between them, the person who, the main warrior, I would say, was a woman, an African woman named Carlota,
mm,
who was said to be Lukumi.
mm,
Um, and it was a triunvirato or triumvirate Cuban plantation or slave labor camp where she starts, she really begins this uprising. But they were somewhat, it was somewhat amorphous. The movement didn't coalesce in the way the Haitian Revolution did. Didn't have a kind of leadership that it did. There was an individual named Polonia Ganga, an enslaved, an African woman whose enslaver had taken her
mm,
sexually, as a sexual possession of his own.
mhm,
And she informed on the movement.
mhm,
She was one of the informants on the movement. So it doesn't take full shape, but it did rattle the island because there was a relationship, not only between Africans themselves of different ethnicities, but between Africans and African descendants.
mm,
So that divide, that pigmentocratic divide, that color divide, really was threatened in some ways.
mhm,
One of the problems that they ran into was there were some people that informed on the movement, like Polonia Ganga, uh, and of course, that sort of thing doesn't depend on gender,
yeah,
or skin color, because you had Carlota, who's a warrior for Black people, and then you had Polonia Ganga, who's probably looking out for herself, maybe trying to get free or something of the sort. Um, but effectively, what you have is a situation where the movement doesn't properly coalesce. And one of the things, there are some debates between people of different hues, Black people, we call in the United States Black people or people of African descent of different hues. There's some disagreements about how these things should proceed. And perhaps tangentially or in a peripheral way, there's some white involvement because once again, the white reformer I referred to before, Domingo del Monte, was the one who helped Manzano to acquire his freedom. He's looking to end the slave trade to Cuba. That's why he wants this slave narrative, so he could demonstrate that Cuban slavery is a detriment to the island, or that the slave trade, excuse me, is a detriment to the island, though he
and,
was himself a slave owner.
and wasn't that kind of exacerbated with the British in 1833 abolishing slavery in their colonial islands, and so it's kind of like wasn't that kind of putting pressure on Spain a little bit?
Yeah, but definitely put pressure on Spain. The British had negotiated a series of slave trade treaties with Spain, and Spain would always, renege essentially. Um, and so the British were also in the process of stopping slave ships from coming, to the Western Hemisphere, and they were intercepting enslaved Africans and either taking them back or relocating them. They began settlements in places like Sierra Leone.
Free town.
Um, that's right. And so Spain was under a lot of pressure. And what Del Monte was hoping was that Spain could be forced to end the slave trade to Cuba so that Cuba could remain white
Mm.
uh,
So it wasn't for
politically.
these, it wasn't for the reason, well, that he felt like slavery was a terrible system,
No,
but
he made
he
his
had,
money off of
yeah,
slavery.
yeah, absolutely, right,
He
and that,
made his money off slavery.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So the movement doesn't properly coalesce. Del Monte's trying to he wants blacks to agitate
hmm
to create a sense of chaos. And then I don't know beyond that what he hoped, because that's not clear in the record to me.
Hmm.
But it appears he definitely wanted blacks to agitate,
Hmm.
and he wanted Placido to use his poetry in order to agitate on the island.
Hmm.
And that's another thing that confirms the fact that Placido was politically motivated.
Hmm.
He was politically astute.
Mm.
And he was deeply involved. He was
Right.
the person to go to.
Wow. Wow.
Even
Wow.
though Del Monte probably knew Manzano better,
Hmm.
had a close relationship to Manzano, Placido was the man to go to.
Right. The
He
people's
became,
champ.
yeah, he became public enemy number one.
Yeah, and there's a reason, because and you yeah. So everybody, first, the link is in the description. Definitely go get the book, and it's a great part of our history as African people, Cuban literature in the age of Black insurrection, Manzano, Placido, and Afro-Latino religion. There's this, like I said, this book is a great historical account, but it's also a great analysis on how African people were able to incorporate certain African ideas, uh, and in this case, in their literature,
Mhm.
uh, in some ways to mask certain ideas, but in other ways to express certain ideas. And Dr. Matthew Pettway does a great job of explaining it all.
Thank you.
And so again, man, I thank you for coming on. I definitely appreciate it.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to watching it, and hopefully it'll lead to even more conversations.
Absolutely, absolutely, man. And so you have a great night, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.